The major chord is an essential sound in almost every style of music, but if you're like me, you might find a plain vanilla major chord a little too bright and not super interesting, especially in the world of prog rock and metal. Here are a few alternatives to a basic major chord. These will all function the same as a major chord, but provide a more interesting and colorful replacement. Now, major chords can sound less bright if they're used in interesting ways by planing them, for example, moving them up or down in thirds, what we call chromatic medians, or just chromatically. But having some different major chord variations is very useful. Before we go into the alternative chords, let's talk about the major chord. Here's a C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. I can build a C major chord by playing the 1, the 3, and the 5, C, E, G. This is the formula for a major chord, 1, 3, 5, and this is also called a triad because it has 3 notes. If you know your major scale theory, there are 3 major chords that come from a major key. In the key of C, that would be the 1 chord C, 4 chord F, and 5 chord G. So the major chord will come up a lot in music, no matter what style of music you're playing or writing in. As I mentioned before, a basic major triad is a pretty sweet saccharine kind of a sound, but there are alternatives to the major chord that will fulfill its function in a chord progression and provide a less bright sound. Now you can do this with minor chords as well, so let me know if you'd like a lesson on that. But I find minor triads in general to be a little easier to use, I think purely because that minor sound is just a little more intriguing on its own, especially if you're dealing with darker, more serious music. What makes a major chord sound so bright is the third. It's that major third interval. So the first alternative is just to get rid of the third. So we'll play 1 and 5, or a power chord. And this is a pretty simple idea, but as a guitarist, this is one I do all the time. A power chord can work in place of a major or a minor chord because it doesn't have a third. Before I get into some more ways to play a major chord, I want to mention that I'm not talking about chord substitutions in this particular lesson. Chord substitutions are when you replace a chord with an entirely different chord. This might be a lesson I'll have to do in the future, but that's an entirely separate topic. Here, if I'm playing a C major chord, for example, I'm just going to be playing a more colorful version of C major instead of replacing the chord entirely. For the rest of this lesson, I'm going to use a simple chord progression to demonstrate all of these different chords. The progression is this: E minor, C, G, and D. This is the minor version of the most common pop chord progression, and as you'll notice, there's 3 major chords in this, so it's the perfect progression to use for these examples. If I play this progression with power chords, your ears will fill in the sound of that third, even though I'm not playing them, just because of how these chords are related. But of course, we can get much more interesting than just basic power chords. Let's turn these into what I call prog rock power chords. This has a 1, 5, and 9. You could call these sus9 chords or add9 chords with no third, or sus2. Doesn't really matter too much, but these can be used in place of a major chord, or a minor chord, or a power chord. I did a whole lesson on these prog rock power chords a few years back. If you want to check that out, I'll link it down below. But this is a great alternative for major chords. Another great alternative is an add9 chord. This is the same as the sus9, but we're going to bring the third back in. So we have 1, 3, 5, and 9. So now we have that third again, but by adding the 9th, we get a richer, more interesting sound. And this almost always works as an alternative to a major triad. So let's use it in this progression. E minor, C add9, G add 9, and D add 9. Here's an example of this in my song Escape Velocity. Here it goes between an E flat major 9 over G and a G add 9, basically a G minor sound to a G major sound. And in the case of this progression, the third of the G major was really important, but I didn't want it to sound like a straight major chord. So adding that ninth brought in the extra color that I needed. Another great way to spice up a basic triad is by extending it and adding a seventh. So we'll take C major, C, E, G, add the seventh B, and we get a C major 7 chord. And just like the add 9 chord, this adds a lot of color. So let's take our progression and we'll add sevenths to all these chords. And we're going to stay in the key of E minor here. So all of our chords will become E minor 7, C major 7, G major 7, and D7, or D dominant 7. Because of the notes in E minor, that D becomes a dominant 7 chord and not a major 7 chord because we have the flat 7 instead of the major 7th. And to me, these dominant 7th chords don't always work great in this style of music. They can, but I think in this case I might opt for doing an add 9 chord, for example, instead. So we could do E minor 7, C major 7, G major 7, and D add 9. Another alternative that doesn't always work but can in some cases are suspended chords or sus chords. In this case, sus2 and sus4 chords. In a sus chord, we're going to take the third and replace it with a different note, in this case, a second or a fourth. A sus2 chord is 1, 2, 5. In C, that would be C, D, G. And a sus4 is 1, 4, 5, C, F, G. Both of these can be used in place of a major triad. I think in this case, the sus2 generally works better, especially with the progression like this. So for example, we could do E minor add 9, C sus2, G major 7, D sus2. Or we could do some sus4 chords too. These have a pretty open sound to them, and they can make a progression feel more ambiguous because we've eliminated the thirds, but they're really beautiful chords. I could even replace this whole progression with sus2 chords. The last chord alternative I want to look at in this lesson are 6 chords and 6 9 chords. A 6 chord adds a 6, so we have 1, 3, 5, 6. And a 6 9 chord adds a 6th and a 9th, 1, 3, 5, 6, 9. A 6 chord can also be looked at as an inversion of a minor 7 chord. C6 has all the same notes as A minor 7, so you could call it A minor 7 over C. So I can use this one in place of a major chord, but it can give me a little bit of a minor sound. I like the 6 chord, but I really like a 6 9 chord. This is one I use all the time. If we look at this guitar voicing, you have all these intervals of a fourth. So in our basic triads, we're stacking thirds on top of each other. So this kind of fulfills the function of a major chord, but it sounds way different and much more modern and interesting. So if I replace all these chords in this progression with 6 9 chords, you'll hear this sound, right? Still sounds like the progression. But much more interesting and more modern sounding. I've even used this chord in metal riffs, for example. I'll play through this progression a few times and try a couple of these different ideas out. So there are a few ways you can spice up your major chords. These have all worked really well for me over the years. So try a few of these out for yourself. And if you want a similar video on minor chords, let me know. And I'll see you all next week. Till then, stay proggy.